Admirable all the students in TIB. Welcome to the first batch of our debate competition that will be held by the participant from the batch 1. I am Munir as the adjudicator and timekeeper today. Also moderator would read the motion, which is this House believes that public protests are the most effective way to bring political change. Well, and it will be debated by both team, affirmative and negative team. Both team has affirmative and negative, whatever. And each of them will have maximum 5 minutes to deliver their statement, and it will be closed by both reply that will be delivered first by the negative team for maximum 3 minutes. Let's see how the debate is going. Since they have already done the case building, let's get straight into the debate. Now, the first turn will be taken by the first speaker of affirmative team. For Sister Fakhul, the time is yours.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Good morning, Honorable Judge, respected member of the executive. Ladies and gentlemen, we are the affirmative team. Before it, I will introduce our team. My name is Fatul Fadila as the first speaker. Beside me, Sania Anjarina, the second speaker, and the next, Karisma Agustin Putri Jojo as the third speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, today the affirmative team hotly support the motion of that public protests the most effective way to bring political change. First, we are not saying that election, courts, or political parties are not important. They can help create change. However, public protests are the most effective because they push government to take action to give people strong voice in politics. Our team believes that political change happens when leaders feel pressure from the politics. Public protests are the best way to create the pressure. Our argument that the protests make government pay attention. Many social and political problems exist a long time before government did anything about them. In many cases, they don't know about this problem, but they do not see a strong reason to act. Public protests change this situation. When large number of people gather and speak out together, government face public attention, media coverage, and growing pressure to respond. In the ring, the issue becomes much more difficult. This idea is brought by Erika Snow and Maria Septet in their 2011 Why Civil Resistance War. After studying many protest movements around the world, they found that peaceful mass protests were often successful in reaching their political cause because they involved many people and create strong pressure on government. One example is the civil rights movement in the United States. Racial discrimination has existed for many years, but large protests have bring national attention to the issue and push leaders to introduce important reforms. Therefore, public protests are effective because they turn people concerned in pressure that government cannot easily ignore. Ladies and gentlemen, political change does not happen simply because people ask for it. It happens when government feel enough pressure to act. Public protests create that pressure, bring people together, and make leaders listen. For this reason, we firmly believe that public protests are the most effective way to bring political change. Thank you.
Okay. Yes, the first speaker of affirmative team spends 3 minutes and 1 second. Next, I'm calling the first speaker of negative teams for Brother Rifki Altaf. The time is yours.
So, honorable for adjudicators and for my fellow participation. As the first speaker of the opposite team, I firmly believe that public protests are not the most effective way to political change. And before I presenting our arguments, I will emphasize that we are talking about public protests are the effective way, and it's not about public protests can wherever create change. The affirmative team, especially the first speaker of the affirmative team, state that protests force government to pay attention. They also claim that protests give ordinary people a voice. But let's talk about what is public protest. We can say demonstrations. Public protest is a mass protest or rally carried out to convey the voice of the people publicly. It should be emphasized that a demo is conducted to express the aspiration of the people, not for personal interest. Does a public protest bring about change? Of course, but it's a demo or public protest is the most effective way? I don't think so. Because most ongoing democratic because most ongoing political change are more often achieved through democratic institutions. Political reforms, political negotiation, elections, and structural organizations. Therefore, we reject the idea that public protest is the most effective way. Public protests only create pressure on politics, but decisions are still determined by state institutions. Currently, many demands are not conducive. They just anarchic, provocative, causing unnecessary chaos, even resulting in calculatives. Let us take the example of the protest that took place in Indonesia on 25 August 2025. In their actions, there were many irregularities, such as aimless demonstration, unreasonable demands, provocative protests, questions about who initiated, AI video that contained information, and even many media outlets that were initially pro-governments participating in protesting against the governments. From this, we can see that demo can generate in such a way by parties who want to gain personal advantage by deceiving the public into public protest. Many activities who used to be the most vocal in demanding governments are now participating in the current government, which raises many questions. We must know that our goal is for a change, and wherever demos so far have been carried out, and it is just shouting in the middle of the road, demanding aspiration that never heard by governments, and therefore we strongly disagree that public protests are the most effective way to political change. Thank you.
Yes. The first speaker of negative team spends 4 minutes and 17 seconds. Next, we are calling the second speaker of affirmative team to Sister Sania. The time is yours.
Okay, thank you for the time. Good morning, everyone. Ladies and gentlemen, the first speaker of Opposition 17 said that the reject public protests are the most effective way to political change. But we know public protests create pressure that governments cannot ignore. Without that pressure, many leaders would have a little reason to introduce reforms. History repeatedly shows that major political change happen after public demand action. Now, let me strengthen our case with arguments. My first argument is that public protests remain effective even when institutions fail. The opposition places a lot of trust in elections, political parties, and government institutions. However, these systems do not always respond to people's needs. Elections only happen every few years. Cards can be slow, and political leaders sometimes protect their own interests instead of public interest. When these formal channels fail, public protests become one of the few tools available to ordinary citizens. This argument is supported by Francis Fox Piven and Richard Clower in their 1977 book, Poor People's Movement. They found that many important social reforms occur when ordinary people organize collective action and research leaders from outside from political institutions. This shows that protests are effective because they give citizens a way to demand change even when institutions refuse to listen. My second argument is that public protests shape the political agenda. Before government solves a problem, they must first see it as priority. Public protests help make that happen. When thousands of people gather around an issue, the media cover it, politicians discuss it, and society pays attention. As a result, governments face greater pressure to address the problem. Charles Tilly, in his 2004 social movement, 1768 until 2004, explained that social movements play an important role in bringing issues onto the political agenda and influencing government priorities. Ladies and gentlemen, in the other words, protests not just demand change, they help decide which issues governments must focus on. And when institutions are slow, unresponsive, or unwilling to action, public protests become the force and pushes them forward. That's why protests create pressure, empower citizens, work when institutions fail, and place important issues at the center of public discussion. For all these reasons, public protests remain the most effective way to bring political change. Thank you.
The second speaker of affirmative team spends 3 minutes and 12 seconds. Next, we are calling the second speaker of negative team, Sister Cerelia. The time is yours.
Okay, good morning, honorable educators. As the second speaker of the opposite team, I will respond to government arguments and then numerous outbreaks. Government said that protests force government to act and put issues on the political agenda. We do not deny that protests play an important role and create pressure also raise awareness. However, government repeatedly confuses pressure with political change. Creating pressure is not the same as creating lasting political change. The actual change happens when institutions act. Agenda setting is not policy making and awareness is not implementation. Even if protests influence institutions are still the actors that pass laws, implement policy, and military power. Government only improves awareness, improves political change. Our first argument is protests create pressure, but institutions create change. Political change is not simply about gaining attention. Political change happens when laws are passed, policies are implemented, and governments take action. A protest can gather thousands or even millions of people, but unless lawmakers cause a government's act is no change in practice. Political scientist Signature in his 2011 book, Power in Movement, explained that social movement will create opportunities for change. However, let's reform depends on political institutions that can implement change. Protests may create conversation, but institutions deliver the outcomes. Pressure alone does not make policies. What we emphasize, yes, protests create pressure, but institutions create change. Our second argument is institutional channels are more reliable and sustainable. The most effective method should practice lasting political change, not just temporary attention. When public attention decreases, participation falls, movements become fragmented, governments can simply wait for momentum to disappear. In contrast, election, political parties, courts, and civil social organizations have direct access to decision. Charles Tilly in social movements 1798 until 2005 that successful movements achieve growing change when institutional influence. Even successful protest movements eventually rely on institutions. If institutions are still needed to shape change, then institutions are doing decisive work. At the end of this debate, effectiveness must be judged by results, not visibility. While protests can contribute to political change, but it's not narrowly the most effective way to achieve it. Protests are catalysts, not the primary mechanism of political change. Government proves visibility, improves effectiveness. For those reasons, public protests are important, but they are not the most effective way to build political change. Therefore, we start firmly on our case that protests are valuable catalysts, but institutions remain the most effective driver of political change. Thank you.
The second speaker on negative 10 spends 3 minutes and 55 seconds. The next speaker will be delivered by the third speaker affirmative team, Sister Charisma. The time is yours.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Throughout this debate, one question has remained at the center of this discussion. What is the most effective way to bring political change? Our team has consistently shown this throughout the debate. Our first speaker explained how public protests force government to pay attention and respond, while our second speaker demonstrated that protests remain effective even when institutions fail and help places important issues on the political agenda. The opposition team, never successful, disproved either of these points. Instead, they focused on a few unsuccessful protests and tried to use them as proof that protests are ineffective. However, no political method success every time. Not every elections produce meaningful reform. Not every political party delivers change. Not every court decision solves social problems. The question is not whether every protest is successful, but the question is whether protests are one of the most strongest drivers of political change. Public protests mobilize citizens, create urgency, attract public attention, and place pressure on decision makers. Most importantly, they create the conditions that make change possible. We explain what start change because public protests can create pressure, strengthen public voices, and push institutions toward action. They remain the most effective way to bring political change. For that reason, we firmly support this motion. Thank you.
The third speaker, affirmative team, spends 2 minutes and 11 seconds. And the last statement will be delivered by the third speaker of negative team. For Sister Amelia, the time is yours.
Honorable educator, as the first speaker by the opposition, my role is to explain why. After hearing both sides in this debate, the opposition has won the most important clashes. As my first speaker established, the government burdens never proved that public protests can contribute to political change. They must prove that public protests are the most effective mechanism for political change when compared to elections, legislations, political parties, courts, policy advocacy, and other institutional channels. The biggest weakness in the government case is that they consistently confuse visibility with effectiveness. Throughout this debate, government may point to examples such as the civil rights movement, women's suffrage, or the anti-apartheid movement. We do not deny that protests played an important role in this movement. However, as my second speaker demonstrated, these examples only shows that protests created public awareness and political pressure. The actual political change when institutions acted through legislation, legal reform, negotiation, and constitutional change. The second major issue is that implementation. Building on my team's case, political change requires laws, policies, enforcement, more than public mobilization. A protest can demand change, but institutions deliver change. The final clash is reliability. As my first speaker argued, the most effective mechanism is not the one that occasionally succeeds. The protests often depend on public momentum and media attention. Honorable adjudicators, government has planned this debate, proving that protests matter. It is about whether they are the most effective way to create political change. Government proves mobilization. Opposition proves implementation. Government proves visibility, and opposition proves effectiveness. For those reasons, we are proud to oppose. Thank you.
The third speaker of negative team spends 2 minutes and 18 seconds. For the next session, it will be the reply speech, and the first reply will be delivered by the negative team. For the reply speech of negative team, time is yours.
So, as a reply speaker of the opposite team, my role is not to introduce new arguments, but to explain why our side has won this debate. This debate comes down to simple questions. What is the most effective way to achieve political change? But affirmative team has shown that public protests can bring attention to issues, and they disagree that we talk about the public protest is about the successful. However, this debate is not about whether protests matter. It is about whether protests are the most effective way to achieve political change. Our first class is awareness versus result. Governments prove that protests can make people pay attention. But attention alone does not create change. Laws, policies, and reforms acts will create change, and those come from institutions, not from protests themselves. Our second clash is pressure versus implementation. Pressure versus implementation. Protests can pressure governments, but they cannot pass laws, enforce or create policy. Therefore, institutions are more effective because they directly produce political outcomes. Our final clash is about reliability. protests depend on public support and media attention. When the attention disappears, many movement is lose influence. At the end of this debate, affirmative team only proved that protests can be important, but we proved what actually change politics. Affirmative team prove visibility and outside prove effectiveness. For those reasons, we are proud to oppose the motions, and we totally disagree that public protests are the most effective way to bring political change. Thank you.
The reply speech of negative team spans 2 minutes and 37 seconds. And moving on to the next reply speech will be delivered by affirmative team. The time is yours.
Okay, I will deliver our reply speech for our arguments. Okay, when you look at this debate as a whole, the affirmative wins for two simple reasons. First, we explain what drives political change. The opposition spend most of these people talking about institutions, governments, and laws. However, they never explain why those institutions suddenly decide to action. Our side answered that question. Public protest transform public frustration into political pressure. They force leaders to pay attention, respond, and action. Further to debate, the opposition accepted that governments often respond to pressure. The only disagreement was where that pressure comes from. Our answer was clear: public protest. Second, we saw why protests are powerful because they belong to ordinary people. Public protests give people to direct way to influence politics. They allow citizens to raise issues, attract attention, and demand action without needing wealth, power, or political connections. This matters because political change is not only about passing laws, it's about making leaders recognize that change is necessary. At the end of this debate, the difference between the two sides is simple. The opposition side asks how change is finals, but we showed you how change begins. And because public protests create pressure, strengthen public voices, and push leaders toward actions, they remain the most effective way to bring political change. For those reasons, we strongly support the motion. Thank you.
The reply speech from affirmative team span 1 minute and 57 seconds. Alright, here we are going to conclude about the debate from the batch 1, and that was the performance. I will leave the judgment to the audiences to judge who is the winner and who is the best speaker from the batch 1. However, before we go into the judgment, I will just close the first batch of the debate and continue moving on to the second batch of the debate. For now, let's give applause to the performer of the first batch. And both sides can return to the respective places. You can say hi to. It's still recording. Don't. Unedited